Okay, so we are in chapter 12. My notes said we were going to pick up about verse 13. And so 7, there's the war in heaven, Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon. The dragon's eventually thrown down to earth. That's verse 13. When the dragon saw that he was thrown down to earth, so there's this epic battle, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. Now, who was the male child? It's been a couple of weeks since we talked about this. Male child was who? Starts with a J, hung on a cross. There we go, Jesus. Male child was Jesus. And the woman, we think, seems to be representative of, you can say it in a couple of ways, but the Israel of God, maybe under both covenants. In the first part of the chapter, physical Israel potentially, because Jesus came through Israel. Second part of the chapter, spiritual Israel, the church. One way to think about it. But anyway, the dragon thrown down and then persecuted the woman, the church, if you think about it that way, who had given birth to the child. Verse 14, but the 2 wings of the great eagle were given to the woman so that she could fly into the wilderness to her place, where she was nourished for a time and times and a half a time from the presence of the serpent. And so now the serpent, the dragon's now being called a serpent in the vision. So when you see wilderness and you think about your Old Testament, what do you think of? What does your mind go to? Yeah, the phraseology, Israel's deliverance from Egypt occurred where, really? In a wilderness. Isaiah 51 verse 9 refers to Pharaoh during the Exodus as the dragon. So even in the prophet Isaiah, he picks up on some of what's being used here in Revelation. And so the woman fleeing to the wilderness, it fills us with a lot of thoughts of what we know about the Old Testament. Exodus 19 verse 4, referring to the deliverance, God states that He bore Israel on eagle's wings and brought you unto myself. When you think of an eagle, you think of power, all those sorts of things that go with the vision of an eagle, and God used that. The more general sense of eagle's wings is in Isaiah 40, verse 31. We sometimes sing, Teach Me, Lord, to Wait. And Isaiah 40, it's based on that chapter in Isaiah. Psalm 78, verse 52 references God bringing His people into the wilderness. So it would put Jewish history in the minds of the original readers when they read a verse like this. The wilderness, was that an easy place to live? Probably not. Hot, bone dry, a place of freedom. But it was also a place where they needed God's guidance, and so He nourished them in the wilderness. And how did He do that? By what during the morning, each morning? Manna, and then sometimes quail, and then He would lead them to water. And so the wilderness was never intended to be the end of the journey for them. It was the prelude to the promised land. It was a temporary place, and you get that sense of a temporary nature of what's going on in verse 14, time and times and half a time from the presence of the serpent. And so the similarities are there to what's being painted here in the picture of Revelation. The woman's problems are not over because she's in the wilderness. So the serpent is still trying to get to her, but she does have God's protection. Even in the wilderness, the dragon is still trying to destroy the woman, but the verse states that she's out of his reach. God is taking care of and nourishing. Verse 15 says, the serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman so that he might cause her to be swept away with the flood. So you get this, Roper calls it a fluidity of symbolism. The symbolism changes a little bit because in verse 3 of chapter 12, the dragon is said to have 7 heads. In verse 15, he's pictured with 1 mouth. And so he can't reach her, so from his mouth is going to be this flood in the vision, of course. Now, one thing that Roper notes in his commentary, floods and raging waters were frequently used in the Old Testament to refer to overwhelming evil. And he gives a variety of references. We won't go and try to read them all, but he gives us Job 27, Psalm 18, Psalm 32, Psalm 69, Psalm 124, a lot in the Psalms, and then Isaiah chapter 8. But again, if you're an original reader and you know the Old Testament, when you start seeing some of these things, they take you to things that you identify with. Roper notes that since the flood came from the serpent's mouth, we should likely think in terms of words intended to hurt and destroy Christians. Lies about them, which resulted in them being persecuted, threatened, those sorts of things. But then verse 16 says, "But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and drank up the river which the dragon poured out of his mouth." Are there some other times where God used the earth to help save and deliver his people? What happened during the Exodus? The parting of the Red Sea, and so the waters parted and they passed through, and then the waters came back and drowned the Egyptian armies. And so that's one of them that you think about. Psalm 66 verse 6 talks about God turning the sea into dry land. And then, of course, then the earth in number 16 opens up and swallows God's enemies. That's another thing that happened. And so verse 16 would seem to be illustrating some of those dramatic moments when God has unexpectedly intervened on behalf of his people. Now, and sometimes it happens in a dramatic way. The road to Damascus with Saul, in a sense, is that God intervening on behalf of his people. Yes. Now, what he's really trying to do there is he's getting Saul's attention because he's about to just completely turn Saul's life around. But there's a providential thing to that, because when you take Saul out of the game, what have you just done for God's people? As taking him out of the game as a persecutor, you've just helped God's people. So God intervenes in a number of ways. They talk about his providence, maybe the death of an emperor followed by a policy change from successors, or a turn of events that would divert attention away from the church. You know, there are a lot of ways God could work to protect his people during that first century that would accord with the vision that's being painted here. And so then verse 17, "So the dragon was enraged with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her children who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus." And so one of the points being made here, I think this one's from Roper. He says, although the church is indestructible, the members of the church are not. Individual Christians remain vulnerable. Now, are we indestructible in a spiritual sense? As children of God. I mean, Satan can attack. He can take our physical well-being in one way or another. He cannot take our salvation from us unless we walk away. The one thing we can always do is, because of the pressure, we walk away from God. But the promise from God is, I've got you. There's nothing that can happen that will remove you from me unless you walk. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 13. "No temptation has overtaken you but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, and what does he do? He provides a way out." Now, we don't always take the way out, but it's always there. So his point, the church is indestructible. The church is, Hebrews 12 talks about the kingdom of God being the one thing that's brought through. It's the one thing that escapes destruction. But the members of the church, we are vulnerable because sometimes the pressure gets too great and we give up. But then he also points out here the distinction between the church as a whole and the individual members who make it up. He says, since Satan cannot destroy the church as a whole, he's reduced to picking off members of the church one at a time the phrase make war is an all-out war even though it's being waged by an already defeated enemy. And that's, you know, if you're old like me, you may have grown up watching Marlon Perkins' Wild Kingdom. Anybody remember that? And so which animal did the predator always go after? Weak, slow, gets away from the group. And there's really there's an object lesson in that for church life, is there not? You know, God did not intend us to be a log that tries to burn by itself. We need to be, that's another metaphor, obviously, but there's value in us being together. We gain strength from each other. We protect each other. It's a lot harder for Satan to pick one of us off when we're together. And so, going all the way back to the Wild Kingdom, there's a church lesson in that, at least in my mind. Okay, anything to add or anything else that you all want to bring up about chapter 12 before we get into 13 and the two beasts? Beasts? I guess I'm saying that right. All right. In chapter 13, two allies of Satan are being introduced, the beast from the sea and the beast from the land. And one of the opening reminders here, and this one was from Roper, reminds us that Satan works through people. And he references Matthew 10, verse 17, where Jesus is sending folks out, and he tells his disciples, he doesn't say beware of demons. He says you got to beware of people. And that's how it's always been. I'm going to read the first 10 verses, and then we'll talk about the first beast, and if we've got time, we'll talk about the second one as well. But to kind of catch some of this more in its context, let's read through the first 10 verses. And the dragon that we've just been talking about, and of course we're still in a vision here, stood on the sand of the seashore. Then I saw a beast coming up out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads, and on his horns were 10 diadems, and on his heads were blasphemous names. And the beast which I saw was like a leopard, and his feet were like those of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him power and his throne and great authority. So verse 2 is going to be a callback to Daniel 7. I saw one of his heads as if it had been slain, and his fatal wound was healed. And the whole earth was amazed and followed after the beast. They worshiped the dragon because he gave his authority to the beast. And they worshiped the beast, saying, who is like the beast, and who is able to wage war with him? There was given to him a mouth speaking arrogant words and blasphemies, and authority to act for 42 months was given to him. Again, this brief time, not forever, a limited time. And he opened his mouth in blasphemies against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle, that is, those who dwell in heaven. So it explains tabernacle there. It was also given to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and authority over every tribe and people and tongue and nation was given to him. That fourfold, all of the earth dwellers, every tribe, people, tongue, nation. All who dwell on the earth will worship him, everyone whose name has not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of the life. Let me read that again. All who dwell on the earth will worship him, everyone whose name has not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who has been slain. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is destined for captivity, to captivity he goes. If anyone kills with the sword he must be killed. Here is the perseverance in the faith of the saints. So let's talk about the beast from the sea. And in reading about the beast from the sea, seemingly corresponds to Rome. Think about Rome as we read through this, as we talk about it. The horrific beast that comes up from the waters bears a striking resemblance to Satan the dragon. Both have 7 heads and 10 horns. The one difference, the beast wears 10 diadems, where the dragon wore only 7, but there is a similarity there. But then, in a perverse way, the beast coming up from the sea also attempts to disguise himself as Christ. The beast here would be a demonic counterpart to the Lamb. And Revelation's using these two images to, you've got the emissaries of Satan, the emissaries of God. The beast, I saw one of his heads as if it had been slain and his fatal wound was healed. He's mimicking, if you would, true religion, the healed wound, a caricature of Jesus' death and resurrection. That's one from Roper. Most commentators believe verse 3 relates to, and I've got another comment about this later in my notes, what they call the Nero redivivus. It's a myth. And again, we talked about this before. What have a lot of people said about Elvis? Yeah, he'd be pretty old now, but for a long time, he fell off the commode, but he didn't really die. He ended up living on an island somewhere. Well, there was some of this with Nero. When he died in AD 68, his body was given at a state funeral. However, many refused to believe he was dead. Rumor was he'd gone among the Parthians, and the Parthians were who to the Romans? Who were the one group that could stand up to Rome? The Parthians. And so there was this rumor he'd gone among the Parthians and would return as head of their army. And Roman historians actually recorded 3 imposters who claimed to be Nero. It would have been like somebody coming back and saying, well, I'm actually Elvis. I've been alive all... Well, there were imposters who claimed to be Nero. And so there was this whole thing. And so part of that may be in play here in the thinking of first century people when you start talking about things that have gone on. Roper writes, perhaps the point of the symbolism was that the persecuting policy of Nero would be revived by another head or emperor as it was under Domitian. So maybe it wasn't the myth about his death. It might have been somebody else, and we know Domitian would. Somebody else is going to rise up and also persecute. A third idea, Roman Empire at times seemed to be on its deathbed, but it revived and came back even stronger. So there's a lot of ways to think about this. Rome appears to be this undefeatable enemy that's just going to keep coming at you. John refers to the beast in order to reveal something about the destructive power of evil, not to conceal the beast's identity. Describing Christ as the Lamb helps attract readers to the innocent victim who suffered for their sakes, while portraying the agent of evil as a horrible beast helps repulse readers from this evil that's represented. Because remember, some of the original readers, what would their approach be to Rome? If Rome's not persecuting me and making my life just completely miserable right now, how might I react to Rome? I might try to get along with them. I might try to embrace some of what they, I might try to get involved in we talked about their trade associations. I might try to just blend in and not be repulsed by them if they're not making my life miserable right at this moment. And so what the point that's being made by Kester in this case, he's saying, that in depicting this vision, part of it is to make sure readers understand the enemy for who the enemy really is and how bad the enemy really is. And so, again, you always have to keep the reading in mind. How did this affect the original audience? Now, in previous chapters, readers had learned that the Lamb shares the power of the throne and the authority of God. That happens in chapter 5. And in chapter 12, now they learned that the beast shares the power, the throne, and the authority of Satan the dragon. That's 13 verse 2. And the beast which I saw was like a leopard, and his feet were like those of a bear, his mouth like the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his throne and great authority. So a conflict is being depicted here, and this happens over and over in Revelation. Can you be neutral? Does God, through John's pen, want you to be neutral? Got to take a side. And so you're being called to side with the Lamb or to side with the beast, and who in their right mind would side with the beast? The Lamb suffered to free people of every tribe and language and nation. That's chapter 5, verses 9 and 10. The beast works to oppress people of every tribe and people and language and nation. chapter 13, verses 7 and 8 that we just read. So readers find themselves called to side with God and the Lamb against evil. The portrayal of the beast draws together traits of oppressive powers from various times and places, creating a composite picture of evil. Now, we're saying we think of Rome, but then also when you read Daniel 7, it speaks of a series of empires arising before the kingdom of God arrives. Daniel envisioned 4 successive kingdoms as 4 great beasts coming out of the sea. The first looked like a lion, the second like a bear, the third like a leopard, the fourth had 10 horns. That's Daniel 7, verses 1 through 8. And so now Revelation comes along and draws all these features into a single beast. The fourth beast in Daniel had a horn that spoke arrogantly, made war on the saints, had power for a period of 3.5 years. That's Daniel 7, 21 and verse 25. In Revelation, the beast itself does all these things. And you see that there in verses 5 through 7. And so the statement from Kester is, by replacing 4 individual beasts with one great beast, Revelation indicates that the threats presented by 4 successive empires are part of one great threat. And I think that's a decent way to think about it. The description of the beast also draws on popular culture of John's time, thereby connecting the reality of evil to the original reader's experience. Many features of the beast correspond to traits of Rome and its emperors, as John's going to make clear when we get to chapter 17, where he's going to connect the beast with the kings of the city built on 7 hills, and that's a reference to Rome. And so that's why when you think about this beast from the sea, it seems appropriate to think about Rome. Verse 1 mentions on his heads were blasphemous names. Roman emperors, how did they want to be referred to? What did they often decide they needed to be called? Gods. I'm a deity. Well, that's blasphemous. And so even in verse 1, on his head were blasphemous names. The Roman Empire had extended from Asia to Europe and North Africa, which means Roman emperors had power over many tribes, languages, and nations. That's chapter 13, verse 7. You get the every tribe and people and tongue and nation, the authority given over them. So admirers praised the emperors with what some considered blasphemous names, such as Lord, Son of God, Savior. And you know, there's a philosophy of leadership today. Some in government they won't consider themselves a god, but they'll almost take on the idea that, hey, I'm the government and I'm here to save you. I mean, we see that kind of thing happening today. So, little doubt that for John's day, the beast from the sea was the Roman Empire. And that's a quote where Roper is quoting Eddie Clower in that statement. So the supreme embodiment of hostility to Christians was the Roman Emperor Nero. And one of the quotes was, when the finishing touches were put on the beast, you painted this picture of a beast, they said Nero sat for the portrait. And so readers would have remembered that Nero ruthlessly made war on the saints. Tacitus, if I'm saying it right, records some being torn apart by wild dogs, others crucified, others burned alive. And here again, the end of Nero's life also gave a perverse credibility to the portrayal of a beast that was slain and yet lived. One of the things, Nero killed himself by putting a dagger to his own throat. Suetonius gives us that, but rumors arose that Nero was still alive and in hiding so that he would return one day to avenge his enemies. And so in John's time, the controversy was kept alive by the appearance of these impersonators that we mentioned. Suetonius and Tacitus both give us those thoughts out of non-biblical history. By combining the threats represented by the 4 empires in Daniel 7 with images reminiscent of Nero, the beast exemplifies the threats that confront people of God in many generations. So the call then has to be to endure in the face of threats, and we find that the ability to endure in that we belong to the Lamb. Verse 8 gets into this all who dwell on the earth will worship him, the earth dwellers, those who don't belong to God, everyone whose name has not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who's been slain. So, is verse 8 teaching predestination? Because some people want to teach that. I tried to speak against predestination this morning without really talking about predestination per se, if you picked up on that. Does God know where you're going to spend eternity if he chooses to? Yes. No, why? Okay.
Because if we did, then we wouldn't have a choice.
Okay. We do have a choice. And this is what I was talking about this morning. God created a timeline for us to live within. But God's not bound by space nor time. And so God's present in the past. He's present right now. He's present in the future, although we've not experienced it yet. For him to know something doesn't mean he's decided it. Does that make sense? If you go rent a movie on a DVD or you're streaming, let's say you stream something. Right. Right. One of the ways that I've tried to get this into my mind a little bit, because like we said this morning, there are things about God that we can't completely wrap our minds around. But if I can pull up a movie to stream it, and I can go to the end and find out how it ends without her, because, and that's God in time. He's not bound by time. So God knows, but it doesn't mean I don't make choices. He just knows what the choices are going to be. So I would say God knows where each of us will spend eternity. But the Bible over and over gives us freedom of choice. And that's one of the evidences of the fact that he loves us. A life without freedom of choice would not be much of a life. That would be slavery, that would be imprisonment, that would be robotic. You'd have I'm sorry. Right.
Instead of, let's eat grandma.
Let's eat, grandma.
Yeah. So if you look at that lamb slain from the foundation of the world, there's another translation that talks about belongs to the lamb who was slaughtered before the world was made. It's a little different reading, but it's more credit
Right.
to the lamb who was going to be the sacrifice before the world was made than our names.
Yeah. Well, and I haven't looked closely at that, so I'm, right.
The reading is just different. To me, it was referring to the lamb and not our names.
Yeah, well, and the whole thing with Revelation and all the Bible, really, all of our names are written in one book or another. And you want to be written in the book of life. You don't want to be one of these or you could say we all belong to one or the other. You belong to the Lamb or you belong to Satan himself. I mean, you belong to one or the other today, but that doesn't mean that's where you have to end up. I mean, based on the choices we make, that can be changed. But, from what we read this morning, God who's all-powerful, he's omniscient, all-knowing, he's omnipresent, he's present everywhere. He's not bound by space or time, so he knows. But him knowing doesn't mean he made a decision, okay? Me knowing how the movie ends that I haven't watched doesn't mean I had anything to do with how it got there. And I think you can think that way about God, and it's fairly accurate. But again, do what? Right, and because the whole predestination thing, Josh went upstairs, but Josh sent me a video this week about, there's a preacher talking about once saved, always saved. And And the preacher basically said, once saved, always saved. If that were true, why would I be here in St. Louis on a Saturday night doing this? You know, it was just kind of this whole logical thing about, and that's kind of how it is with predestination. If God's already decided, why am I in worship? If I want to be, that's fine. But if I don't want to be, that's fine too. If God's already decided, it doesn't matter what choices I make. So, right. Yeah, it may have been one of the verses Dad just mentioned a minute ago, and it seems like there was one of the ones in Psalm 139. Isaiah 46:10. Okay, let's read Isaiah 46, verse 10. And then I want to go back to Psalm 139, too. Let's see. Isaiah 46, verse 10. Declaring the end from the beginning, and from the ancient times things which have not been done, saying my purpose will be established and I'll accomplish my good pleasure. So you get that. I was looking for the verse. Let's see. Or it may be in the other passage we used this morning. You know, verse 16 alludes to it, your days of seeing my unformed substance, and in your book were all written the days that were ordained for me, when as yet there was not one of them. You know, God knows the pathway. But that's not what I was looking for. It must have been one of the other passages I used this morning. I'll have to find it. It is a tough thing to wrap our minds around. But if we don't have freedom of choice, then so much of everything we stand for just really falls apart. Okay. No. Oh, it was Psalm 139, verse 4, and I was reading out of the New Living this morning, and I'm looking at the New American Standard right now, but verse 4, you know what I'm going to say even before I say it. Well, how's that? The Psalm 139, verse 4 out of the New Living. You know when I sit down or stand up. You know my thoughts even when I'm far away. You see me when I travel and when I rest at home. You know everything I do. You know what I'm going to say even before I say it. Well, how would that be? How would God? Well, it's because He's present 10 seconds from now. He's present a minute from now. He's not bound by space or time. He looks on the whole thing outside. He transcends our universe. And right there, David's acknowledging it. How do you even wrap your mind around this? It's hard. But God knows. He's all-knowing, but He gives us choices to make. And anybody that would deny we have freedom of choice isn't being honest with themselves, right? You had a choice to get out of bed this morning or not. Well, if you're a kid, your parents might make you get out of bed. But, I mean, we all had a choice to make. We all chose whether to be here at 6 o'clock tonight for Bible study, and we made the choice to be here. We all make choices every day. Either we have freedom of choice or we don't. We know we have freedom of choice. And so, there's so many of the warnings in the Bible that just have to go in the trash if we don't buy into this. And so, right. Right. Yeah, and I mean, we have examples in Scripture where prayer caused God to change his mind on the timing of things. But the fact that he changed his mind, his ability to transcend time doesn't mean he didn't know what he would end up doing. And again, it's hard to understand, but I don't have a problem with God knowing right now where I'm going to spend eternity, because it doesn't change my responsibilities at all. It doesn't change a thing for me. Every day I have to be tempted and say no to temptation every day. None of that changes. Whether God knows where I'm going to spend eternity or not, I believe based on my best understanding of Scripture, he can know because he's all-knowing. But it doesn't change my responsibility. If you're going to say he can't know or doesn't know, it doesn't change your responsibilities either. You've got the same responsibilities I do. It's not. It's not. The fact that he knows doesn't mean he made a decision about it. It's two different things. To know something doesn't mean you had anything to do with making it happen. Right.
And he pulled the knife down, and he drew back, and he was going to kill him.
Right.
He says, now I know, which is in present tense.
Right.
If he knew he was going to do it, he would have said, well, now I know that you was going to do that. But he didn't say that.
Who was that for, really? Was it for God or was it for Abraham? That was for Abraham.
It's still in the present tense.
Right.
It's not in the past tense or the future tense.
Yeah.
It was in the present at the same time. So therefore, if he knew he was going to do it, he would have said, well, I knew he was going to do that. But he didn't. He said,
Yeah.
now I know.
Yeah.
But when he called him out of his tent, he had him look at the sky at the stars and said, this will be, your seeds will number like the stars of the sky.
Yeah, it was a faith lesson for Abraham. Let's see. Let me do the last. Let me get these last couple of verses, and then that'll set us up to do the beast from the earth next week. Verse 9, if anyone has an ear, let him hear. Listen carefully, be discerning, understand. And then verse 10 is a little weird. It says, if anyone is destined for captivity, to captivity he goes. If anyone kills with the sword he must be killed. Here is the perseverance and the faith of the saints. Now, I'm going to talk for a couple of minutes about verse 10 as we finish up. It's an interesting statement. It's a callback to Jeremiah 15 and Jeremiah 43. There's also a reference to a sword that would remind us maybe of a statement Jesus made to Peter in Matthew 26. He says to Peter, put your sword back in its place, for all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword. So it could be a callback to that, but there's definitely a callback to Jeremiah 15 and Jeremiah 43. But there's also some ambiguities in some of the manuscripts, so that the King James translates the verse to apply to the persecutors. The NIV applies the verse to those being persecuted. And so some of it hinges on how we understand the term anyone. If anyone is destined for captivity, what are we talking about when we talk about anyone? If it's referring to Christians, the Lord seems to be telling Christians to be resigned to whatever the physical future holds for them. And, that's not necessarily out of bounds. If it's my lot to suffer, Revelation 2 verse 10 tells me to do what? Be faithful unto death, and you'll receive a crown of life. And so that way of reading the verse isn't wrong. It would be consistent with Revelation 2 verse 10. However, if you read the anyone to refer to those who are doing the persecuting, then it would be assurance to Christians that enemies would eventually be punished. Now, elsewhere in Scripture, that's a truth that's taught. Who gets it right in the end? God does. So the people that hurt people, God will deal with them at some point. So there's also a school of thought that says the first anyone could refer to the Christians, the second one could refer to the persecutors, which would then allow you to combine both of those ideas. Roper's take is that it likely applies to those who were oppressing Christians. Jeremiah's use of this similar language was directed to those who had rebelled against God. In chapter 14, the fact that enemies would be punished was referred to as the perseverance of the saints. We'll see that in chapter 11, or chapter 14, verse 11. And his thought is that way of looking at it would have been of greater comfort to the Christians. But in the end, it is kind of a weird verse. But he does say the basic message of verse 10 is found in, here is the perseverance and the faith of the saints. That's what, this is about. So you get the beast from the sea, and then in the second part of the chapter that we'll get to next time, we'll have the beast from the earth, and that's where we actually get into the 666, the numbering of the beast from the earth, and so we'll talk some about that. Anything else on the first part of chapter 13 that you all want to bring up or ask about, mention, anything along those lines?